In the 1980s, after a short, riveting bio snippet of Bonnie Raitt's highs during her successful music career and the lows of her drug and alcohol abusing days, she was asked by a music journalist to talk on camera about the most challenging time in her life. The interviewer had obviously assumed that the lead in video would be the perfect segue into her answer about her struggle with addiction. She surprised him. In fact, even before her days of drugging, it was high school that was the most difficult time for Raitt. She was uncomfortable in her own skin all through it, and said she would never want to go back to that time period. I felt immediately validated after watching this. My own childbirth story may not have ever happened, but for my own starring role in a drama that was set in the time period that is everything after the relative safety of junior high. High school is a wicked institution for anyone to get through for many reasons. It's a time when hormones run amok en masse in boys and girls, pushing every pimple to the surface and launching a menstrual period. The chemicals in the brain alone giving every real or perceived social slight the extra fuel it needs to bring a good spirit to her knees. Any little sense of self-doubt is exacerbated by others also doubting you. It's survival of the fittest in many ways. The prettiest, the smartest, the most athletic, the richest, hell, the most popular for any reason. And I could claim none of those honors. Add to that all of the chaos and tyranny in my home life, making it one of the most agonizing time periods for me. My father Arnie was 30-something, married to his third but not final wife. He was supporting 8 kids and an extremely opinionated mother-in-law we knew as Nana. My self-esteem and overall emotional well-being, I am convinced, was the very last thing on his mind. But as I have become and made the mistakes of a parent myself, I no longer fault him for his seeming disregard for me. It wasn't personal. He was just spread much too thin to give the consistent dad and mom support that I desperately needed. Because of Arnie, me, and the time period that it was just an icky era for me. I was 15 years old. I felt ugly, angry, unwanted, and for the most part worthless. I did my best to fit in. Just like the majority of teenage girls, I felt uneasy in my own skin, which made me socially awkward. On top of that, I was barely keeping up academically. From our tumultuous beginnings in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, the Lakota home and tribal headquarters of my mother's family, and the well-to-do home of my father's German immigrant family, we had moved all over the western United States and had settled in Spokane, Washington. We lived in Spokane for 7 years, the longest we had lived in one place. The Potter family lived on one side of us. I walked to the bus stop every morning with Robin Potter. Her parents smoked heavily. She was spindly, had freckles, and little color in her skin. She was, by my estimation, not at all attractive, but she did have the girl balls to try out for the cheerleader squad in our 9th grade, and she made it. And despite her telling me that I could do it too, I was just too fearful of the potential rejection. The Matsui family lived up the street. Jeff played basketball and wrestled with my older brother Steve. My brother Steve was popular, good-looking, and an athlete. I was able to milk my association with him for about a year before he dropped out of school and left for the U.S. Navy. Mount St. Helens erupted in western Washington on May 18, 1980. The volcanic ash traveled 500 miles and blackened the skies soon after we arrived home from Sunday Mass. The soot raised hell with vehicles all over the city, and the haze lasted for weeks. But for me, it paled in comparison to the disaster that would hit even closer to my home. In August 1980, only 10 months away from my graduation from West Valley High School, Arnie announced that he would be moving us from our sleepy West Coast suburban Spokane neighborhood 2,000 miles east to inner city St. Louis, Missouri. He had just 2 months before become a born-again Christian and decided that he was being called to study the Bible at a seminary in the Midwest. I thought he did fine providing for us as a meat cutter, but apparently he felt his newfound love of the Lord meant something loftier for him. All that disruption may have been well and good for him, but not good news for me and my siblings, and it was the hardest on me and my sister Denny. Not only were we being forced to leave every friend that we had known since elementary school, we were moving to an entirely unknown part of the country. We were both in high school, and we had no say whatsoever in the matter. I don't remember anything about the move itself, but I will never forget the culture shock of moving from a completely white-bread West Coast high school to an inner-city, big-city school that was undergoing the first wave of mandatory school racial desegregation efforts. Desegregation was at the time a concept that was as foreign to me as St. Louis was. McKinley High School, now the McKinley Classical Leadership Academy, a revamped magnet school, is on the near north side of downtown St. Louis. It is located just blocks away from what was then the Cochrane Gardens housing project. The infamous Cochrane, built in 1953, was a public housing high-rise, far from any type of dwelling found in Spokane, Washington, or South Dakota. Cochrane was abandoned in 2006 and completely demolished in 2008. Most high school students who lived at Cochrane attended McKinley. The school was 95% African American and 4% poor inner city white kids. And then there was me and my sister Denny, two half American Indian, half German girls. We had very little in common with either group. We both tried hard to fit in at McKinley. It was part of our DNA to adjust to wherever in the country Arnie Schneider dragged us. I joined the all-black concert choir. I volunteered for the media club. Denny became a cheerleader, and as she always did, had many boy admirers. Even though a year and a half older than Denny, I was awkward and plain. All of it made for a very uncomfortable senior year for me, but I pushed through. Despite the fact that there were no college graduates in my immediate family, I was determined to graduate and get past high school and go on to college. I wasn't at all certain what I wanted, but I was anxious to discover a life free from Arnie, his wives, and all of the anxiety that surrounded him. I really knew nothing at all about the culture of the black kids at McKinley, but I had even less in common with the inner city white kids. They spoke with odd Missouri country accents, kept to themselves, and didn't get involved in things like choir, sports, and the media club. I became fast friends with Junie McClurking, who came from a large black gospel-singing family. I had my long chestnut brown hair styled into plaited cornrows with colorful beads that hung on the end. Learned how to make chitlins and can still croon the bars to God is truly amazing. It wasn't Spokane, but I pushed through it. And truth be told, learned some things that forever broadened my horizons. Denny did or did not fare as well, depending on how you look at it. After falling in love with a boy she met at my father's new Lutheran church, she ended up getting pregnant and dropping out of high school completely. She is still married to her liberator and still lives happily in Missouri. There's one thing that should be said before I go on. My early years were filled with a lot of trauma. Too much for this book, but because of it, I survived everyday life to that point by perfecting the art of dissociation. The DSM-5, the latest Bible for mental health professionals, defines dissociative disorders as being characterized by a disruption of and or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. Dissociative symptoms can potentially disrupt every area of psychological functioning. In layman's terms, dissociation is a way of coping when someone is met with life experiences that are overwhelming and or traumatic. Suffice to say, from the outside, I may have looked and acted like a normal high school girl, but I was frequently untethered from emotional and even physical sensation. I bring this up only because I believe it was this psychological coping mechanism, unhealthy as it was, that allowed me to check out during what would be to most teenage girls a heartbreaking year. Just 2 months away from my graduation, I met Michael. I don't know where or how it was that I met Michael. Like many difficult things I have blocked permanently from my memory, I just don't or won't remember. It wouldn't have been at school, as he had graduated high school several years earlier and was already in medical school at St. Louis University. The SLU campus was just blocks away from our home. Michael was from Montana. I was 16 and he was 22. He lived in his own apartment above a funeral home on Grand Avenue. Normally, my dad, his wife, and Nana would have objected to me seeing someone so much older than me, but Michael had several things that kept him in their favor. First, he was in college and from all appearances confident about his future. Looking back, I realized that he was very smart, but used his intellect to manipulate me and my parents. My folks didn't seem to see it, but I felt more than a little patronized by him and often embarrassed by his predilection for showing affection for other young women while he was with me. Second, and maybe most important to a narcissistic father who was concerned about what other people thought we looked like from the outside, he was drop-dead gorgeous, Marlboro Man gorgeous. He used his good looks and promising future to woo anyone in any given room. He was smooth. Why he chose me, I don't know. I still don't know. But in truth, he was a turnoff for me. I dated him, but was always suspect of his motives. The senior year clock was creeping ever closer to prom time. Michael was just a distraction for me, but as good as any other, he would be my prom date. I don't recall where the 1981 McKinley High School senior prom was held in St. Louis. I was drunk on Everclear by the time I arrived to a DJ playing Lady by the Commodores and Kim Carnes' Betty Davis Eyes. I wore a pale yellow chiffon dress that I put little pre-thought or pride into. I paid for the dress completely out of my own babysitting money. My dad and his wife would never have considered investing in such an extra expense for me. Michael knew no one at my school. It wouldn't matter. I think we stayed for all of 3 dances. And then we left for his apartment. I remember only one thing after leaving the prom. At that time, my sexual experience and knowledge of all things sex was limited to 2 things that were very traumatic for me and that I will not share here. Suffice to say, sex to me was harrowing and was meant for the pleasure of the other person. I protested. Michael told me, before I passed out on him, that I could not get pregnant. He was the medical student after all, and who was I to question him? I didn't see Michael again after that night. I wanted nothing to do with him, parents and Nana, love him or not. I ignored his calls and his visits to my house. For weeks after the prom, I didn't have the tiniest inkling that I could be pregnant, and the thought of sex with him made me nauseous. Or I thought it was because of the thought of sex with him. This may sound very cold. In fact, I would not find out until my first stint in alcohol treatment 10 years later that it was my dissociative state that allowed me to detach during the first 2 months of my pregnancy, or more likely all of it. There were certain things that I knew to be absolutely true then. One was that I could barely take care of myself. I had no comprehension of, desire for, or ability to raise a child on my own. Second, it was unthinkable to me, the idea that a child on the way or anything else would force me to remain with Arnie and another one of his wives for 1 day more past high school graduation. I would not keep the child if it did not go away on its own, and I begged God that it would. I would get rid of it, and I almost made it happen. I almost made the bus for Kansas City, Missouri, just 4 hours west to a place where it was legal for me to get an abortion. I was 12 weeks along in my pregnancy and held out believing it was true for as long as I could without having my family know. Somehow, Arnie found out on the very morning that I was leaving on the Greyhound bus from St. Louis to Kansas City. He called me into the family room and asked me if it was true. There were a couple of times early in my life when my father showed incredible kindness. That morning was one of them. Though there was a lot of silence between us that morning, he said that if he would have had an abortion when I was conceived, he would not have ever had me in his life. I think I was more surprised at his expression of affection for me than his desire that I not follow through with an abortion. I didn't get on the bus. I didn't have an answer. I hadn't changed my mind about not keeping the baby. At the time I was babysitting for a married couple, Don and Agnes Hunsaker. They lived across the street from us on Russell Avenue. He was an attorney, and she was a yuppie stay-at-home mom. My sister and I both babysat for them at least 1 night a week. When they heard from my stepmother that I was pregnant and not wanting to keep my baby, they invited me over for a visit. They wanted my baby. Not for themselves. They had friends who were wanting to adopt a baby after failing to conceive on their own. I don't remember, but I'm fairly certain that my response was probably, "Okay," just like that. Now I just had to check out for the remainder of my pregnancy, and then it would all go back to the way it was. I was skinny growing up. In the 6th grade, I was called Olive Oil. Yeah, like Popeye's waif-thin girlfriend. Today I would pay to have a body like that. But then it made me feel self-conscious and homely. I was able to hide my baby bump until I was nearly 7 months along. Not that anyone was watching or asking. After graduating from McKinley, I had very little contact with any of the friends I had made since arriving in St. Louis just 9 months earlier. I didn't drink alcohol much, but weirdly, I had never smoked cigarettes and still had intense cravings for ashtray ash after the morning sickness subsided. I didn't give in to the powerful urge to lick the silvery gray residue when I would pass by glass ashtrays. I learned later that this was more than likely due to a mineral imbalance. The months passed. I kept to myself and my dad's house. I visited a prenatal clinic twice during my pregnancy, once to confirm I was pregnant, the second at about 6 months when I was scolded by the doctor for not coming regularly and promising and lying that I would be back. I did what I could mentally and physically to ignore the new life growing inside me. At about the time that I had visited the doctor for the second and final time, the private adoption being arranged by the Hunsikers hit a big snag. The state of Missouri had outlawed private adoptions which would allow an individual to legally turn over custody of a child. Child licensing agencies such as Lutheran and Catholic Social Services and the Division of Child and Family Services did have authority to arrange a legal adoption. In theory, it makes sense. This allows for proper vetting for adoptive families and deters nefarious transactions for people who are desperate for a child of their own, and I suppose in this day and age, the prospect for human trafficking. My goal was to go dark for the remainder of my pregnancy, and once the baby was born, bolt. I dreamt only of college. Soon I would be free of Arnie, his wife, and her mother, who always resented me and my sister Denny and my brothers Tony and Steve for being part Indian. Or maybe for just being with my dad before she was, I don't know. In her defense, it could not have been easy to be married to Arnie Schneider during his early years and being a stepmother. I saw more of the St. Louis Lutheran and Catholic Social Services than I did the St. Louis City Hospital OBGYN. I learned about the bureaucracy involved in handing over a life to strangers. Because I was relinquishing the rights to mother my child, the social service people were obligated to reach out to Michael as well. I was 8 months along when I was called in by one of the agencies. I do not remember which. I didn't care. They were all yucky people. They advised me that after contacting Michael, he had expressed interest in keeping the child if I were going to give it away. The thought of that was absolutely unacceptable to me. The baby should go. He should go. It should all go away. My parents called the Hunsikers for legal advice. The answer we received was unexpected. They had friends who had given up trying to adopt a newborn and instead adopted two older children. I took comfort in the idea that the baby would go to a family with children. They assured me the family was of good standing. It would not be legal for me to go through with a private adoption, and I could be charged with child abandonment. I did not want the child. I did not want Michael to have the child. I would risk becoming a criminal. It was settled. I would have the baby. As far as the world knew, I would take the baby home and raise it. In truth, my parents would hand the baby off to strangers. But I was confident that they were good strangers. The Hunsikers were good people. The day I went into labor was like any other. I had blocked much of it out, but here is what I do remember. The date, March 15th, 1982, the Ides of March. My water broke in my bed sometime in early morning. Because it was my father who raised me, it was he who fielded all of the female questions that I had. He served as my mother and my father during times when there wasn't a stepmother or girlfriend in the picture. I had asked him when I was 9 what it felt like to have a baby. He said, "Like you're pooping a couch." That morning, I wondered if it could truly be as painful as all that. The place, the old City Hospital of St. Louis. Today, the antiquated high-rise has been transformed into luxury condominiums for women who may never have had the anxiety of birthing a child they would never see again. It was a rough labor, and I have a low threshold when it comes to pain. As I was screaming, one of the delivery room nurses/Catholic nuns said, "Colette, it's not as bad as all that." It really wasn't until later that I chuckled at how idiotic that proclamation was coming from her. It was as bad as all that. But I got through it. Barely. Still flat on my back, I could see him above me in the round security mirror hanging in the right corner of the ceiling in the delivery room. His skin was red with white chalky splotches of vernix. He had a mop of shiny black curly hair. The nurse announced 10 pounds. I knew it would be the last glimpse I would ever have of him. My dad Arnie, who could be charming at points, came to the recovery room with a glass dish filled with M&Ms. I spent the night in the hospital. I had asked that I not be allowed to see the baby once it was born. I had to give him a name. It would be Joseph, after my paternal grandfather. I would never call him that. I would never hold him, even once. But he would leave the hospital with the name Joseph Schneider. My stepmother carried Joseph out of the front door and down the steps of the hospital and handed the baby to who? I never knew. I assumed that it was into the arms of the Hunsikers. I would never see Joseph again, and if I did, he would probably not be called Joseph. I put it all behind me. 1983. I went on to Fontbonne College and the Edward R. Murrow Broadcast Center in St. Louis. After 1 year living in the dorms on the Fontbonne campus, I discovered that I could not afford to live on campus for even one more semester. Sister Mary Charity, my speech coach, suggested that I look into a live-in nanny arrangement near campus. In the wealthy neighborhoods of Clayton and Ladue, Missouri, there were many of them. I interviewed with several families, all wealthy, all in homes that I could never have imagined visiting, let alone living in. Ultimately, I chose the Slavin family. Or more truthfully, they chose me. It was love at first sight when I met them. Alberta had actually been born and raised in South Dakota, where I was also born. She met Raymond in college. They were energetic, loving, beautiful, and very curious about me. I shared with them few truths about my past. Later, they would often wonder aloud why it was that I had so little to do with my family of origin. It was incomprehensible to them that Arnie would leave me off at college and not check in, ever. The Slavins were Jewish, a brand new culture shock for me. They changed the trajectory of my life. Dr. Raymond Slavin was a well-known immunologist who made his mark on the medical world during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. His wife, Alberta, was a local CBS television news consumer reporter. They had 3 very successful, educated, handsome sons who lived away, and one daughter who was exactly my age, but really needed a sister of sorts to stay with her while the Slavins traveled, which was often. And they traveled far, leaving me and Linda in a house with 4 living rooms, a monstrous fireplace, grand piano, and a fountain in the backyard. The Slavins paid my tuition when I was short, which was virtually every semester. They bought me my first car. They counseled me on my GPA and my credit score. They introduced me to classical music, the symphony, and other Jewish people. They took me on family vacations to their vacation home in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. They hosted the wedding of one of my needy classmates in their extraordinary backyard. It was a poor college girl's dream life. Life was very good with the Slavins. Then in the first truth is stranger than fiction moment of my life, an almost inconceivable thing happened. It was during my 2nd year living with the Slavins. Dr. Slavin was always looking out for me. One evening at supper, he announced that he had a medical resident that he thought would be a perfect fit for me. The resident was single, originally from the Great Plains like I was, and what he thought I would appreciate most at my age, easy on the eyes. By then I was dating several young men. Most were in college, but some were not. Always the placater, I accepted Dr. Slavin's blind date for me. Could it be? I dare not ask any telltale questions. Did he happen to live above a funeral home? I reasoned that it couldn't hurt to at least meet someone Dr. Slavin thought would be cool. He may have said his name, but I don't recall. At any rate, what could it hurt? It was all so improbable. I must just be paranoid. McKinley High School was a world away. The Slavins would be out on that Friday evening, as was very normal for them. Linda was out with a new friend, and I would have the house to myself, just me and my blind date. Door chimes. There he was. The space between us, Joseph, and my new life collapsed, all in one swing of the palatial wrought iron front door. Lots of dark, curly, shiny black hair, just like his son. Perfect skin and teeth. Montana grin from ear to ear. He was there in the flesh inside the marbled foyer on Polo Drive in Clayton, Missouri, just a 40-minute drive from where my father lived on Russell Street in downtown St. Louis, but what I thought was a solar system away from my new reality. just Michael and me on a rainy Friday, Missouri evening. My blind date was the father of my son. As he waited silently in one of the 4 living rooms of the Slavin home, I cracked ice cubes in the kitchen for our iced tea. My spirit left my body. Alone in the house, we talked for what seemed like several hours, but was more likely no more than a half hour. I don't really know. As if nothing had ever happened between us, he suggested we might start seeing one another again. I told him no, and that I had only agreed to see him for the sake of the Slavins, and that I was already seriously involved with a guy who wanted to marry me. The first part was true, the second a complete lie. As I look back, I didn't feel unsafe with Michael that night at the Slavins. I had in truth consented to the intercourse with him on prom night 1981, the night I became pregnant with his child. Ugh, maybe it was because I went into a dissociative state. Maybe I just felt that I deserved the punishment of his company once again. I don't know. The next morning at breakfast, Raymond and Alberta were anxious to hear about my big date with the doctor's very handsome medical resident, Michael. Their wide-eyed, shiny, anticipatory smiles changed instantly to frowns of obvious displeasure when I told them it was fine. He was nice, not really my type, but he was okay. It was okay. I changed the subject and went on with my life. I said no more about it, and they would never know otherwise. I would leave the Midwest after 4 fairy tale years with the Slavin family. I would leave with a dream to do broadcast news. It would be years before even one other soul knew otherwise about the child I gave away.